Uncle Mark.
Yeah.
I've been thinking. I've looked for hobbies for myself, and I'm not a hobby guy really.
Right.
So maybe there's a group I can join.
Yeah, maybe somebody that is welcoming,
like some sort of a lobby.
Someone that lets you sit at the welcome table, and
and,
you know what I mean,
and is eager to have me, and they want to teach me about their ways. It just seems like that's the kind of thing I'm looking for.
Yeah, I same here, and they don't really want you to go home, and you kind of just have to eat what they say, and yeah, it's belonging, it's community,
and it almost always ends up in murder suicide. But you got to take the good with the bad.
Yeah, 50% of the time.
I like those odds. Well, I will satisfy that itch, Dan.
Nice. I love it when you satisfy my itches.
We've been doing this show for what seems like an eternity, but in reality has been 138 episodes spanning about 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
However, in Trump time, it does truly seem like eons ago that we started this little thing. I looked at the main headline for the day the podcast debuted of October 2nd, 2017.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And it was the mass shooting in Las Vegas that killed 58 and injured over 500.
Oh, my God. Seriously?
Stop it.
Yeah.
It was the same
Why
day.
would you do that to us?
It was the same day.
It was the day that Santa Claus decided to give an extra Christmas to all the children.
Correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. It just seems like we've been living through a series of nightmares, of which that was just one that's receded from our memory.
Yeah.
And each one somehow is worse than its predecessor. And now we're facing a reality where, as of this record, just over 80,000 of us have perished alone and lonely of COVID-19, with well over 1.35 million confirmed cases. But both those stats are almost certainly low because many people have died of unrelated ailments that were made fatal by COVID-19.
Yeah.
And with our shamefully low level of testing, we don't have a fucking clue how many people really have it.
Right.
Well,
and also Republican officials are undercounting in their municipalities and states to try to help keep the numbers down.
Well, and also ours is not the only country that is suffering from this pandemic.
Truly.
Absolutely.
So there's lots of other folk.
We're just doing it the American way.
We seem to be excelling at it, but that's truly true.
We're fucking good at it.
This is around the globe. And while many of us are facing the terrifying reality of having to re-enter the workforce with this virus not only present but ascendant, many of us, of course, didn't have the option or luxury to quarantine ourselves and have been living through a crisis as psychological as it has been physical. We've all sacrificed so much physically, financially, and emotionally, and in many other ways to get us to this point. We've fought to flatten the curve, to keep grocery store workers and hospital workers and teachers and so many more safe by social distancing to try and mitigate the virus, the spread of the virus. And yet, our news feeds are full of people recklessly going to beaches, parties, or businesses with no masks and no regard for other people. Uncle Dan, you had some neighbors have a party last night, right?
Yeah, I don't need a news feed. My next door neighbors were throwing quite the rager last night, including outdoor karaoke and apparently they rented their own dispensers for alcoholic slushies. So they were really rocking.
Tell me they were playing bobbing for apples in like a warm, kind of nutrient-rich bath.
I can't imagine that they weren't.
Yeah.
It was very clearly we don't believe in this liberal hoax party.
Right, and that's the worst of all. There is a group of people who are convinced that this is all a hoax and demand that people remove their masks and have been even physically accosting people by getting in their faces and spraying potentially deadly droplets all over the place. The former group, going to the beaches, are mostly just fucking idiots, but the latter group resembles nothing as much as a death cult.
Yeah.
Since the Venn diagram of these virus deniers and the MAGA hat-wearing Trump crowd is a perfect circle, that makes Donald Trump their cult leader. And we've, obviously talked about this before on the show. It just seems to be kind of hitting a fever pitch right now.
Fever pitch, yeah. Unintended.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was watching the news the other day as a group of people gathered for a, virus-denying rally. I don't remember where, but I'm sure we all saw it. There were no masks. People were aggressively shaking hands to own the libs. And one woman was screaming at a clearly terrified reporter who was wearing a mask. and screaming that it's all a conspiracy and blah blah blah. And this poor reporter was literally shaking. She was so afraid, and I thought, what can we do about what is clearly turning into a death cult right before our eyes? And then I realized, you know who's been doing a lot of reading and thinking about cults for the past couple of years? Your audio uncles.
Yes.
Oh, God. Suddenly I feel pressure.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to talk to you guys today about what, if anything, we have learned about cults, cult leaders, and cult followers that might give us some guidance in these dark times. So a little background on our qualifications. And we are not experts on anything at all. And, we've more or less just scratched the surface on most everything we've ever covered. But we've done segments on all major religions, including Christianity, and specifically within Christianity, Catholicism, the Mennonites, the Amish, the Anabaptists, the Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostals, and the Church of God with Signs Following. We've talked about Mormonism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, the Sikhs, Scientology, the Jains, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and the Native American Church. We've talked about true and undeniable cults like the Church of the Creator, the Cult of the Shining City, the Anthill Kids, sorry about that, the Westboro Baptists, Falun Gong, Science of Identity Foundation, Colony of Dignity, Cult of Reason, Eastern Lightning, QAnon, the Order of the Solar Temple, the Branch Davidians, the Family of David, the Divine Light Mission, Heaven's Gate, the Unification Movement, the Manson Family, the Thuggies, the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, cargo cults, Aum Shinrikyo, the People's Temple, the Raelians, the Creativity Movement, and even science fiction cults like the Religion of the Klingons, Crom, and Jediism.
We've covered a lot of cults.
We've covered a lot of cults.
And we're just scratching the surface.
Like half of those.
We're scratching the surface of just the sheer quantity of cults out there.
So for amateurs, we're pretty advanced.
Right, exactly.
Cult understanders.
We've talked about religious leaders like Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Paul, Muhammad, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, L. Ron Hubbard, and David Miscavige. The former just a few minutes ago. Cult leaders like Mark, how do you say it? Roche Theriault, I think. Roche Theriault, Fred Phelps, Lee Hongzhi, Chris Butler, Paul Schaefer, Antoine Francois Momoro, David Koresh, Marshall Applewhite, Sun Young Moon, Charles Manson, Credonia Morindi, Shoko Asahara, Jim Jones, and Ben Klassen. And we've even talked about religious adjacent kooks like Ken Ham, John Harvey Kellogg, Grigory Rasputin, John McNaughton, Ayn Rand, Brian David Mitchell, Aleister Crowley, Pastor Robert Jeffress, Pastor James McDonald, Pastor Paula White, Pastor Benny Hinn, Ray Comfort, Mike Lindell, Mitt Romney, Mother Teresa, Peter Popov, Art Bell, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, Gwyneth Paltrow, David Icke, Father Coughlin, the Dalai Lama, Lawrence Pastor, Oprah Winfrey, Dr. Oz, Dr. Phil, Deepak Chopra, and Mark Hoffman.
I think I just had an aneurysm. Is that a thing?
So that's that, Doug. That was our audio resume, I suppose.
Well, and that's what's crazy is since we're focusing today on cults and their leaders and followers, this list does not include dozens and dozens of dead gods, dead religions, silly stories, holy technologies, the panoply of nefarious woos, and all of our how-tos. So,
wow.
So, given our background, what have we learned, if anything, useful about cults, their leaders, and their followers? I'll just start off with, since I have been thinking about this in preparation for this segment. As for cult leaders, perhaps the most universal characteristic is toxic narcissism. It becomes so insatiable that it eclipses the desires or even the physical and emotional needs of their followers. And because you cannot, as a cult leader, allow for criticism or disagreement, the leaders come to think of themselves as all-powerful and all-knowing. So, I can't think of a cult whose leader, at the very least, is not a horrid narcissist.
I can't think of one off the top, for at least the ones that I've done. I can't think of one off the top of my head. The toxic narcissist and folded into that is as you said, a blatant disregard for the health and safety and needs of others, and oftentimes like a clinical inability to understand that those exist,
or even an enthusiasm to deprive their followers of things.
Yeah, cruelty.
Yeah. And I mean, denying food or water or sex or even fucking sunlight is a pretty common characteristic of cult leaders.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's sociopathy, it's psychopathy. It's like you usually get a lovely cocktail of an inability to be an actual human.
Yeah, and there's you mix in a pretty common sense of entitlement, an obsession with money, willingness and often enthusiasm to berate followers publicly as a way of breaking people down, the constant need to be the center of attention, a terror of being publicly humiliated, and a complete inability to admit mistakes or apologize for actions. I know that this sounds pretty much. Oh, and of course, there's a sexual component pretty much every time.
Yeah, as Steve Hassan said a few weeks on the show, it kind of comes down to sex and money.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and I know that pretty much if you're going to have a cult, there's going to be some kind of sexual criminal behavior mixed in there at some level, oftentimes at very, very high levels. So
I can't think of one without it. I can't think of one.
Yeah.
Where that hasn't been the case.
Yeah, I mean, and we could talk for a brief second about what the difference between a religion and a cult is. Uncle Dan, you once said it was the number of followers, basically.
Well, that's one way.
Well,
I know that demographers have often looked at it that way.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, if you've got 10 adherents to your kooky philosophy, it's a cult. If you've got 1 billion, we would call it a religion. But somewhere in the middle of those two numbers is the threshold or the tipping point where we would say, oh, well, but is there a difference, substantially?
There may be, but I don't think it's a bright line. I think there's a lot of slop over.
Yeah.
Right? Like we look at Mormonism, I grew up in a cult. The Mormonism I grew up in was a cult.
Right.
And maybe it's changed somewhat, and maybe it's modernized, or at least tried to legitimize itself in the eyes of the broader world a bit. So, like there's just you can't just put things into two separate buckets. Is a cult, isn't a cult.
Right. And at the end of the day, is there any reason to do that? Like is it useful? Is it useful? And I read an article in the Baltimore Sun that was a few years old from a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago named Sam Fleischacker. Pardon me if I mispronounce that.
He's in the witness protection program. That's not a real name.
He had another metric, and it was really interesting. He says in his thinking, a cult becomes a religion in about 100 years. And the thinking is, it's actually pretty interesting, is that most cults are reflections of their charismatic and almost always bizarre leaders. So if a cult can last through several successive generations, it will typically soften its hardest edges, and for the most part, it will calm the fuck down. And
that's an excellent point, I think.
It is a good point. And it'll even find some acceptance in the larger culture just because you're used to it. Mm-hmm. So, I mean,
totally.
But I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if it's a cult, what it's classified as. If it's, believing in dangerous and terrible and useless things and causing harm, then it's of a kind, right?
Well, and those who study cults, I mean, I see a lot of talk about, things like what makes it a cult is the behaviors. Are you pressured never to leave? Are you told that you're going to be completely shunned if you do leave? Are you pressured to behave in certain ways, or does it just feel like it's voluntary?
Right.
Because a lot of these things, like the social pressure is, and that's what makes Mormonism a cult, is that the social pressure is so tremendously high to stay in and to conform to very, very narrow ways of thinking and ways of behaving.
Yeah, right. and as Steve Hassan said again when he was on, sorry to bring him up again a couple of weeks ago, with his bite model, what aspects of your life are being controlled? Your appearance, your diet, your dress, your media consumption, right. And
but
so
wouldn't that make Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia 100% a cult?
Absolutely,
right?
Of course.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think it's a matter of perspective. There's a whole bunch of different ways of looking at it. But as we talked about these characteristics of cult leaders, it sounds like I'm reading a psychological profile of Donald Trump. Yeah. And I think we can all agree that he is at least comfortable with his status in the mind of most of his most ardent followers as a semi-religious cult leader.
Any way he gets that attention is fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
And he appears to be animated and even invigorated by the suffering of his own followers, even more than his enemies sometimes.
Yeah.
But we'll never get close enough to Donald Trump to talk to him about this. and it seems unlikely that any kind of argument or reasoning would ever be effective on such a damaged or defective human being. So let's focus a bit on the only part of this equation that we'll ever have contact with, and it's the followers. We've talked about the reasons that people fall for cult leaders and cults are pretty widespread. The target audience for L. Ron Hubbard's cult was slightly different than the Anthill kids, right? Like there's different appeals and different reasons, but the characteristics of the leaders tend to be very similar.
Yeah, and I don't know that I don't know necessarily that that's true 100% between the Anthill Kids followers and the Scientologist followers. These are all people seeking some remedy to some pain or trauma in their life, right?
Right. Vulnerable people who are seeking help and camaraderie and companionship.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it seems like Trump's followers share a fear of a world that will no longer look like them, and that they may not have any use for them. And an evolving environment is always ripe for cults.
Yeah, systemic shocks are always a good time for cults to do their work.
Exactly, and whether those systemic shocks are real or perceived is kind of irrelevant.
Right.
And rather than trying to help them overcome their fear, which I would postulate, or I would say our previous president tried to do, Trump has allowed them to wallow in their fears to the point of ruin.
Oh, he's turned it into a blast furnace. Yeah, totally.
I mean, his statement that he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not pay a price was shocking at the time. But it seems that even he underestimated the fervor of those who tossed in with him. I mean, these people are now actively spreading a deadly virus to show their fealty to him.
Oh, there are people who would gladly volunteer to be the person on Fifth Avenue who he shot.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Just to prove him right.
Yeah, I mean, and we've all wondered when we would reach the point where his followers would look in the mirror and not recognize who was staring back at them. But I don't know that point exists, and it may. I think as a group, as a collective, it doesn't.
I think there are those people on the margins of his cult that will have a crisis of conscience. Some of them already have, and some will at some point. But I think there's a real priesthood in there. There's a real unshakable percentage of the American public. Maybe it's 25% that will never, under any circumstances, leave him.
Yeah,
And the thing about his cult is that he has tied it in, and they have tied it in with their Christianity. So it's literally like half of the people that are proclaiming him to be this amazing president are major pastors in the world, in this country. People who claim to speak for God and claim that God supports this president.
Well, and I think one way he's done that.
Sorry, some slightly mainstream ones like Jerry Falwell Jr. and Franklin Graham, right?
100%.
Well, and I think one of the ways he's done that, that Trump has done that, and he's been very effective at it. And again, I'm never sure how much intention there is with this guy, but he's provided his followers with a well-defined enemy that dovetails really nicely with these religious groups. And it's immigrants, it's liberals, it's the press, it's the deep state. Other dark forces are all out to take him out, and by extension, take down his followers. So, again, he's absolutely poured gasoline on the fire of fear, and it's completely scrambled the brains of these people.
Well, fear and trauma, I think, are the main drivers of anybody into an irrational situation like this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there can be other things. I just don't think fear and anger are ever missing, among the many factors.
Yeah.
And I mean, these people have ruined family and professional relationships to follow him. They're basically,
which is true of any cult, people who join cults. Absolutely.
Exactly. And they're basically in the throes of a nationwide sunk cost fallacy. The only way out is through. They cannot abide any thinking that would show even a small part of the edifice is false, because of course that would mean it's all false, and they've ruined their lives for nothing.
Right.
They've turned off information. Nothing gets through to them. They're mired in conspiracies. It's cult behavior from top to bottom, and it's fucking terrifying and disheartening.
And a lot of times, the cults that we've examined, you guys, a lot of times they kind of happen in the shadows, right? These things develop like the Branch Davidians and the Anthill Kids and whatever. They're just kind of fringe or literally out in the forest where we're seeing this happen on prime time every day, like on every news feed every fucking day. So withdrawing the horror of living through this as a reality for a moment, this is an amazing study in what a cult is and how they work.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, there's also this thing. There's a new forest out there. There's a new backwoods where these are brewing, and that's the internet, where you can go to just your little corner and have your little conspiracy sessions with your believers in QAnon, and nobody has to know about it, and none of your friends have to know that you're a QAnon conspiracy theorist, and none of your family has to know until you're ready to tell them all about it.
Yeah.
And and so there is still a secretive nature to the whole thing.
There is, but it's also because it's the president of the United States, it is an unavoidable reality to observe.
Yeah.
Right.
And we're in such a crisis that requires federal national leadership that the spotlight is shining on him and it just doesn't turn off. Right. Like so the sense of empowerment that his most ardent followers are feeling is becoming chronic. But I don't want to get too negative on this, because we also, as we've done our reading and research and segments on these cults, there is one thing that we have consistently seen and heard from people who have made it out of cults. And I really think this was the most succinct encapsulation of it. I'll go back to our segment on the Westboro Baptist in episode 125. The granddaughter of Fred Phelps, Megan, had a list of 4 things that we can do to help people get out of cults. And I'll just recap them here.
Yeah.
Don't assume bad intentions. Ask questions. Stay calm. And make the argument. And like you said, Uncle Mark, the cult of Trump is defined by anger, fear, and volume. Anger, fear, and volume will not work on them. They feed on that. No,
and as Steve Hassan said, is like it is useless to tell people in a cult that they're in a cult.
Right.
Like it doesn't help if the goal is to try to help get them out of it and try to make this horrible malignancy go away. That's the wrong approach. And of course, like many times with the skeptical community and with people who aren't in religion, it is incumbent on us to be the bigger quote unquote man.
Yeah.
Right. And to
or at
calm
least,
it down.
Or at least, act smarter.
Well, and it's we've talked about this before, but it's hard, especially specifically about the Westboro Baptists. It's hard to be calm and it's hard to be, clear and keep your head level when there's a guy with a long gun yelling at you during a pandemic, right?
Right.
Like the whole cult
and you're stressed too.
Yeah. Like, and that is not only an offensive weapon of the cult, it's a defensive weapon of the cult. Because if they can get you to lose your temper and start yelling back, then they're safe from you.
You're playing their game now, and they know the rules better than you.
Right,
do.
They're practicing every day. But we've learned a whole new vocabulary through this crisis of social distancing and contact tracing and this kind of thing. And if we've all worked so hard to flatten the curve of the virus, the physical, actual virus. It seems like the same tactics can be effective on a mental virus, which is what the cult of Trump is. And if we can, get enough people to stop being members of it and therefore stop being vectors of it, right? Like we can slow it.
And to be clear, I feel like we do need to clarify that this isn't about conservatism. This isn't about like GOP versus, Democrats versus Republicans. This is specifically about this man and his incredibly dangerous way of doing things and the very clear and present danger that he poses to democracy itself, not just to, one way of thinking.
Yes. His particular, mental virus has found the conservatism and republicanism as vectors, as vehicles for it, right? So there's no way to pull that out of the equation.
Right.
But we're not, the point you're making, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, is we're not liberal Democrats sitting here telling you that Republicans are evil.
Right.
This is a much larger issue.
Yeah, we're in an existential crisis.
Yeah.
And certainly as a nation. And the followers of this person are willing to just kind of give away everything, essentially to protect his feelings, give away everything that makes, we're an imperfect country, but there are many admirable things. Those will all be cashed in to protect this person's ego.
Yeah. And I want to be clear too. I am a liberal unabashedly. And I will, this isn't the podcast for that, but I'm happy to make the argument about why I think the ideas I espouse are better than blah, blah, blah. But, we're, like you said, Uncle Mark, we're talking about an existential crisis. We're talking about, we haven't been on the knife's edge like this since the Civil War.
This kills people across the ideological spectrum.
Yep. There ain't no right. There ain't no peeing section in a public pool.
Yeah.
Do you remember when there were smoking sections in the restaurants, though?
And planes.
Yeah.
Wasn't that cute? When they used to have a section?
Yeah.
So, I don't want this to be a hopeless message. I do think that even people who are seemingly completely lost, the human brain is a pattern-seeking structure that wants consistency, and untruth and stupidity are hard for the brain to hold in itself. That's why these things do so much damage to the brain, right? The brain trying to reconcile itself with itself. But, if we can reason with these people and be kind and empathetic, we can make a difference. Oh, my cat wants to say something.
Well, I hope that that's true. I haven't seen a lot of evidence that reason is working, but maybe I'm just so fatalistic now that I can't see it. I have hope that that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, I also can't just say that things are rosier than you think they are. They're not.
Right.
But we're, like you said, Uncle Mark, we are watching probably the largest social experiment vis-a-vis cults in history in real time on the TV.
On all the networks.
Yeah.
At once. But, and it feels a little bit hopeless, but to quote the great sage philosopher G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle. And just understanding what is behind this movement and what is fueling this kind of lurch into the most anti-scientific, anti-factual hall of mirrors in history is it's important to know, and it's important to understand, and I'm trying to understand it every day.
And exactly. we're not PhDs by any stretch of the imagination, but we certainly have spent some time thinking about this crap.
Yes, we're highly advanced amateurs. So right. Great news, everyone. I take that into your week and have a wonderful time, and happy whatever.
Okay, let's move on.
Let's move on.